Hi, welcome back to the Black Pill, the only YouTube channel where some hairy dude drives around in his hearse talking about shit. Hopefully. Um, let's talk about feudalism and slavery. In a feudal society, everyone but the king is a slave. The king has absolute power, absolute authority. The king can order you killed after a 10-minute show trial or no trial at all. And there are soldiers willing to carry out those orders. Thomas Becket murdered by the king's men because he simply opined one day in his private study where he thought nobody was listening, that life would just be easier if Thomas Becket were dead. And the soldiers ride to Canterbury Cathedral, wherever, and stab him in the face until he's dead. The king owns all the land. The forest belongs to the king, and all of the deer in the forest belong to the king. Taking food to feed your family is poaching, and poaching, like most other things, is punishable by death. The king owns the lords. The lords all owe the king their fealty, their loyalty, their devotion. They have lands that are granted by the king that can be rescinded, taken back by the king. From those lands, they must pay taxes. And to pay those taxes, they are granted absolute authority over serfs or peons. Those low people farm the land, raise animals for meat, wheat and corn for food, and they pay differing amounts to the local lord, to the castle. When the taxes are high, the lord, of course, sometimes has to take almost everything grown by those peons, serfs. The serfs belong to the land belongs to the lord belongs to the king. And the lord only owns that land on the sufferance of the king. It's possible all the lords together could overthrow the king and appoint a new king. Sometimes it happens, sometimes there's a civil war. It's relatively easy to prevent that from happening. Just sow enough discord among the lords that nobody wants to see anybody else succeed. If we pull down the old king, who would be the new king? Sow enough distrust that it isn't even possible to have that conversation. That's feudalism. In a feudal society, if you're not the king, you are a slave. Of course, there's a lot of nuance. Even in a feudal society, even in a monarchy, you could be a relatively highly placed slave or a relatively lowly placed slave. There's all the difference in the world between being the lord of the castle or even his lady and being the person who scrubs out the poop chutes or works in the field. In American slavery, there was a loose rank structure. House slaves could expect better treatment than field slaves. In the end, they're both slaves. Some are merely treated slightly better than others. But this creates a dynamic where when people feel like they're not at the bottom of a pecking order, that there's some fairness or rationality in a system where they potentially might possibly rise, even if that rise is not realistic. And then systems become somewhat self-maintaining. The experiment of democracy is exactly to end this sort of slavery, with one authority at the top who can make decisions completely disregarding the agency of everyone else in the system. Democracy, when correctly enacted, allows the most people to flourish. What about something like American sexism? In the beginning, all men were created equal, but not really. Men meant landowning Anglos. By the Civil War, men at the federal level meant any male citizen. But of course, black people were not permitted to vote in the South until about 1965. And even now, actions are taken every day to make it harder for people to vote based on their skin color, which is predictive of their voting preferences. And of course, women were not permitted to vote until 1920. And again, that's white women. In America, we've had traditional gender stereotypes, roles, values, and norms. And this means that men have the majority of the power. We're not saying that men are the slave owners and women are the slaves. There's a lot more nuance here, but almost all Fortune 500 companies are run by men. Almost all high government positions, executive positions, are held by men. Almost all of the menial childcare work is done by women. A system like this is called a patriarchy. Family names are handed down based on the male lineage. The father's name survives, the mother's name is eventually lost to history. Male children are more valuable than female children because they have more earning power. In America, we have eroded much of that second one, but not all of that second one. In the patriarchy, men have more power and authority. Relationships are unequal because women, to a degree, rely on men for income and security. If we rank all of the so-called Western democracies on sexual egalitarianism, America does not fare well in that ranking. And the more that women rely on men for income and security, the more they marry men and the longer marriages last. When women have freedom, economic parity, political parity, then they just don't need men and they don't submit to marriage the way that they do in more authoritarian cultures. One thing this gives rise to is American men who like certain women of color. If it occurs to you, gentlemen, that you really like Asian women, consider it might be harmless exoticism, but more likely it is that in Asian cultures where gender parity is not as close as it is in the United States, women speak to men differently. Women speak to men deferentially. Women need men for income and for security. Being rude to men might possibly be dangerous, and it might limit one's opportunity to make a good marriage. Men in America often like the company of women from more sexist countries. When women in America make an equal wage to their partner, or more than their partner, it can be difficult for the man to absorb. He might wonder what it is he brings to the relationship if it is not income and security. If she can take care of herself, economically and physically, then what is it that she needs from that relationship? In a country where men's relationships with men tend to be very competitive and risky and dangerous, when we're taught to keep all of our feelings inside, to limit our self-knowledge because it might be dangerous. It's hard for us to see why a woman might love us for ourselves and want to have a relationship for the sake of the relationship. And we might like to have those edges, guarantees that help keep the woman around. Again, it's not that men in America are the slave owners and women are the slaves. There is nuance, but it is more likely for the male to have economic power than the female in a hetero relationship. As in a feudal society, women often benefit from the patriarchy. Certain kinds of women benefit from the patriarchy. If the king has granted you power, you are the lord. And as long as you stay on the good side of the king, you stay very powerful, very powerful. Even in the Downstairs crew, watch an episode of Downton Alley, there are power politics at play. The head butler has absolute authority over all of the serving staff in that household. That is a nominally powerful position. The most power, in fact, that a serf can hope to acquire in their lifetime. And in a sexist society, some women benefit from that sexist society by being attractive and often white. White women can often buy out of a lot of the labor required of women of color. White women often have a certain amount of social power over men and women of color. When the dominant in-group decides the hated out-group of the day is Mexicans, then white women, by degrading and verbally attacking people who seem to them Hispanic in public, can gain a certain amount of social advantage within their in-groups. Some women work to maintain the patriarchy because they exist at the highest level of slave or servant within that patriarchy.